Hi friends, my name's Rich and welcome back to the Movement Podcast. Over these last few episodes, we've been looking at how life has changed in lockdown. And we've been speaking to some of our friends from various different backgrounds and been listening to what they've been up to. And in our last episode, we spoke to our friend Jamie, who works with Open Doors. And he was telling us some of the stories of friends in the persecuted church and how they've been adapting. Well, in today's episode, we're going to be talking to our friend Emily, who's just recently returned from the mission field in South Africa, living and working with the community at Live Village. Some of you might have heard about Live Village, some of you might not, but hopefully in this next couple of moments you'll hear a little bit about what Emily was getting up to out there. So in true Movement Podcast fashion, we sent Matt off to have a chat with Emily, although you know the drill. They did it all via Zoom.
Hey friends, welcome back to the Movement Podcast. Today I'm excited to be joined with one of Movement's own. We're joined with Em Hatton. Em, it's great to have you.
Hi.
We're going to be hearing a little bit about what you've been up to these last few months. You've been on quite an adventure, you've been on quite a journey, but it actually began a few years ago. Maybe without me spoiling anything, you could start that story off and tell us a bit about who you are, what you've been up to and how you got there.
Yeah, so I grew up in a Christian home, going to Soul Survivor every year, that kind of thing. In 2016, I saw the Live Village choir. So Live is a cluster foster care village for about 200 kids, orphan and vulnerable kids in South Africa. And in 2016, they were doing a tour around the UK. They came to Soul Survivor. I saw them and I was like, I just have to go there. And so when I finished my degree in 2018, I was like, oh, what am I going to do now? Not sure. Oh, wait, why don't I go to Live? So I went in the September of 2018 with a friend from uni, and we volunteered for about 5 weeks on the village, and we had a great time. And then I got to the end of that time and I was like, I'm so not done here, but I don't know what to do next. So in January 2019, a few months after getting home, I went back to the village. I went back to volunteer in the school for 3 months on my own, which was great. I had the best time. But again, I got home and I was like, I'm still not done with Live. I have to go back again. So spent from April for a few months really not knowing when I was going back and what I would go back to do if I did go, but knowing that's where God was calling me to spend the next time, spend the next season. So in summer, had some conversations and ended up applying to do Live for Change, the discipleship school program at Live. Got accepted, and in January set off for 6 months to go back to Live to do this discipleship school. So yeah.
Brilliant. And you've been in South Africa for how many months is it now? Obviously you're back home.
So I was there for 5 months, coming home a bit early because of Corona. So yeah, a good 5 months.
And as we see, this has been a journey over a few years. There's been these gaps in between. I guess in the waiting, there was that excitement, there was that anticipation. We experienced a bit of that doing life and family together over at Movement. But what was that like? What was that for you knowing that you were called to be back somewhere, but there was almost this waiting time building up to it?
Yeah. So when I didn't know what I was going to be going back to do, when I initially came home from my second trip, it was really hard, actually. It was a season of really not knowing what exactly it was that God was calling me to do. I knew that he was calling me back to the village, but not knowing when or how or for how long was actually just really, really hard. So for that initial few months, I was working in retail. I wasn't finding it fulfilling at all. And yeah, so that season was hard. And then I applied and I got accepted for Live for Change. And then it was just really exciting. And it was like, can I go back? I'm just so excited. Going back to the place that I love, that is my second home, was just very exciting.
Brilliant. And you've been out there the last few months. We've been missing you here. But what exciting things you've been getting up to? What's day-to-day life? What's that look like for you? How's that journeyed? And just a little bit of insight into that.
Yeah, so Live for Change, as I said, is a 6-month discipleship school. So it's in 2 parts. The first part is more of a teaching phase. So we had teachings on identity and sonship, so what it means to be a child of God, and really coming into the knowledge of who you are, who God's calling you to be, and what he's calling you to do with your life. So we had a lot of teaching around that for the first couple of months, which is amazing. And alongside that, we were serving the village in any way that they might need. Sometimes that meant carrying loads and loads of chairs across the village. Sometimes it was putting on running events. Sometimes it was gardening. We also did weekly visits into the community. So I got to go into the creche most weeks in Cottonlands, in the community just outside the village. Other people got to go into the community clinic. So really seeing what life is like outside, I guess, the privilege of what Live is. So yeah, and then the second part of the discipleship school is an internship phase. So for me, that was working in the youth department. Because it was during lockdown and there was no school, I was doing 10 weeks of holiday club, which was crazy. Loads and loads of sports, basketball, netball, spike ball, anything. And if you know me, I'm not sporty. So that was my first lockdown challenge, was to do a lot of sports.
So good. And when so often people go into mission trips or they go into volunteer and they go in as complete strangers, not necessarily known people, but there's quite a journey there. How's it to do life together? How's it to do community with those other volunteers coming in from different backgrounds and maybe coming as strangers, leaving as family? What does that look like?
Absolutely, coming in as strangers and leaving as family is so right. So as part of Live for Change, I was doing it with 15 other people. 14 other people, and we shared rooms, we shared communal space, we shared bathrooms. You get to know each other very quickly when you're living together like that. So these strangers that, to be honest, I've been a bit scared about living with because they were all going to be 4 or 5 years younger than me, became family so quickly. But the beauty of Live Village is that you do everything together. You do church, you do school, you do work, and living alongside each other together day by day. So it is just one big family, people coming from different places in the world to come and volunteer, to come and serve. So yeah, that was just so much fun. You get to work alongside the people that in the next few hours you're playing netball with, or you're eating when playing games with. So yeah, it's great.
And for us at home, we've been getting your update emails. We've been staying in tune, praying for you and all this. And there's been quite a journey within yourself with what you've found with your relationship with God. Maybe you could talk about how your faith has been significantly impacted by these last few months and what God's been doing and saying to you during this time.
Absolutely. So part of the Live for Change program is that the first thing you do in the morning is spend an hour with God, an hour in the Word. And so the start of the day in South Africa tends to be around 6 o'clock. So that was a 6 till 7 time with Jesus, with my cup of tea, trying to wake up. And to be honest, at the start of that, in January, I was like, I feel like this is actually quite religious to be, this is the time and this is how long I'm going to spend and this is what I'm going to do. But I really quickly came to love that time, came to feel like actually an hour is not that much time to spend reading the Word. I have learned so much through that time. And actually one of the big things was that coming home after Live for Change, the one thing that I can bring home is the consistency of spending an hour with Jesus in the morning. And actually you don't get to know a person until you spend time with them, and any relationship is worth investing in. And so that's what I've found, is that as I've invested in spending time with my friend, with my father, I've got to know him so much better. And actually, that's how you learn to hear someone's voice. You learn to recognize your Father's voice as you spend time making intentional spaces in your day to listen to what he's saying to you. Yeah, so that's been really important for me as I've come home. I did come home early because of Corona, because it was getting a lot worse in South Africa whilst it was all easing up here. So it seemed like the right time to come home. And as I've carried on that rhythm of my day, I've really heard God speaking to me about how to pursue him and how to be in a time where friends are feeling really far, days are feeling a lot more empty than they were feeling when, in comparison to being around people all the time, busy all the time in South Africa. Yeah.
As you say, you had to come home early in the end due to the global pandemic, but that kicked in and there was a couple of difficult choices that had to be made during that time. Maybe you could share what it was like for that news to be coming into somewhat of a secluded place, a community not quite in a bubble because there's the wider community within the area. But what was that like to receive the news of what was going on back home whilst you're out there, what was happening in South Africa at the time and the decisions that had to be made? How did you see God in that?
Absolutely, yeah. So it came to South Africa quite a few weeks after it hit Europe. So to begin with, I was like, what is this coronavirus? What's going on? Like, it just didn't affect us at all. And then at the beginning of March, we had our first case in KwaZulu-Natal, which is a region of South Africa that I was in. And President Ramaphosa did a speech and said, this is what's happening in our country now. It's come in. And our leader said, right, although all the other discipleship schools that are happening around the world are going to end and sending their students home, we're going to keep going. You can stay here, but the choice is yours. You need to listen to God's voice and make that decision for yourself as to whether God is calling you to stay or to go home. And so after a lot of prayer about it, I really felt God was calling me to stay on the village and to serve. And so I did, and I was really glad that that's what he was asking me to do, because there was no part of me that was ready to come home yet. So we had to do a village lockdown before the rest of the country went into lockdown. We closed the gates, which meant that people from the community that came on and off the village, people that came on to work and to serve, weren't coming onto the village anymore, which meant our responsibilities increased. We started making food parcels for people in the community that couldn't feed themselves. And we started, as I mentioned before, doing holiday club, which was very, very intense. And those kind of things. So village life looked a lot different. We'd gone from being able to go off to the beach, go off to the shops every weekend, to being around each other all the time, which was such a lesson in bearing with each other in love and in patience. And then the situation over here in England started easing a lot. But the peak started coming in South Africa, and the government issued 10 repatriation flights for British nationals to come home. And again, we were given that decision as to whether God was calling us to leave and go home or to stay on the village for a bit longer. And we were 3 weeks off our graduation point of Live for Change, and there was no part of me again that was ready to come home yet. But and I really actually felt God was calling me to stay and serve. But with each change of events, as I heard that the situation was getting worse, there was getting better here, it kind of actually just felt like at the end of John's Gospel, when Jesus says to Peter, "Peter, do you love me? Look after my sheep. Peter, do you love me? Do you look after my sheep?" And he says it 3 times. And that's a bit what it was like for me. God was saying, "Emily, will you obey me? Will you do what I ask you to do?" And he's asking me to stay. And then with each change of events, with each bit of extra information, it was, "Emily, do you obey me? Will you go home now when I'm asking you to go home?" And so that was a big, big moment of to surrender my will, to surrender my desire to stay on the village, and actually just obey him and go home when he was asking me to. So I flew home a week after we found out about the repatriation flights. And now I'm here, and I've been back for almost 3 weeks now. So yeah.
And as you say, it's that obedience to God's calling that was significant. It was that almost, as you shared about, when you're spending time with him, when you're learning to hear from his voice, that intimacy that you have, that led to the ultimate decision. I guess you talked about how you wanted to continue that rhythm back here in the UK. You wanted to continue that time. How's that gone? What's it looked like now you're back home?
Yeah, so I think the best thing is that it's now not at 6 o'clock in the morning. I do sleep through a bit, but it's still the first thing that I do every morning. I pick up my Bible and I spend time with God, and I just see where he's leading me that day. And actually now having more time in my day to fill, I actually get to do that a lot more throughout the day. I get to read, I get to journal more and actually just see where he's leading me. So, for example, last week, I was beginning to feel really, really overwhelmed by the fact that people just seems really, really far away. I had all this time on my hands, and I was thinking about what my next steps are. Now I'm home. I need to start thinking about my future and what God's calling me to do with my life in general. And I was beginning to feel really overwhelmed by that. And I just actually felt God say, go and take a walk. So I went through all the fields in our village and just went for a walk, plugged into some worship music, and just felt really connected to God in a way that I hadn't really since being home, actually. And I was just in these open spaces, there's nobody around, and it was just so freeing. And as I walked through all of these fields and I got to the top and I sat down, and it's a bit like in Psalm 23 where the psalmist writes, he leads me beside quiet waters, he makes me lie down in green pastures, and he restores my soul. And I actually just felt this restoration of like, actually, I don't need to be overwhelmed by anything because God has this. And he leads us into open spaces. There's another Psalm, Psalm 18. He leads us into open spaces and he restores me because he delights in me. And I walked through these fields and I just gave everything that I've been holding back. I gave it all to God, and I just let him speak into those situations and let him just release me from them and just say, and he just said, pursue me, because that's all you need to do. You just need to pursue me and I'll do the rest. Because actually he's not calling us to pursue things. He just wants us to pursue him, pursue our relationships with him. And I think that's probably the biggest thing that I've actually learned through the last few months of Live for Change, is that pursuing him is all we're ever called to do, and to walk in obedience with him, to walk in obedience with his will, and the rest actually just falls into place as we do that.
That's so good. I was actually about to ask how you process changing from different country, different culture, different community, that sense of perhaps restriction on freedom that we've all been experiencing at different times in different ways. And as you say, going and spending time with God and just bringing it and pursuing him above all things seems to be how that's been. But maybe you could share a little bit about like the emotional side of that, because that's it's one of those things we always look back on. We're like, oh, why did we see God in this? Why didn't we just do this straight away? We could see his hand in hindsight. But what was that like initially? What was that? The hardship in that, I guess.
Yeah, well, it was really big coming home. I wasn't ready. My two big prayers of Live for Change were that I would have closure on the village, if that's what God needed me to have, by the time I came home, and that I would know what was next. And actually, a week before I came home, I didn't feel like I had an answer to either of those prayers. But actually, like, coming home, I've had space to process that. It was hard leaving the 14 others that have become my friends, my family, really quickly, leaving the place that I love. But actually, just really seeing that he has brought closure on that season, because I'm happy to be home. I'm happy to be able to socially distance with my friends here, spend time with my family, and really actually look into what's next for me. But yeah, I've had to do a lot of processing about it, because it's big. It's big when you God brings an end to something sooner than you're expecting it, but actually God only ever brings an end to something when he's got one bigger and one better for you. And something someone said to me before I left was that you have to believe, if you believe that God's called you into a season, you have to believe he calls you into the next season as well, and his hand is totally on it. And I think that's really important to remember for this season, that actually God sees everything. He knew that this was coming, and so we can have hope that he knows what's coming next as well. We can have hope that he is here with us now, and that he will work all things together for the good of those who love him, and that he'll call us into the next season because he'll have one bigger and one better for us.
Incredible. And as we come towards the end of our time together today, is there any other stories, any other insight, encouragement that you feel God's placed on your heart to share with those who might be listening, maybe those who are particularly interested in what mission and serving looks like across the season? Obviously, we don't know what that's going to look like in the future. We don't really know what's happening right now, let alone in a year's time or whenever that may be. But what would you say to those listening who have a similar stirring on their heart as what God stirred in yours?
Yeah, I think if God's calling you to mission, just do it. Don't question it, just do it, because you're just going to have the best time of your life if you do it, and God will always use you where you are. So in this season, we're not going too far at the moment. We're not going too far geographically, but God will use us where we are right now. For me, one of the big things God's been speaking to me about is how I use my voice. So I think at the moment we're all a bit guilty of using social media a lot more than we normally will. But something that God's been speaking to me about is how I use that platform. So as I'm mindlessly scrolling through Instagram, scrolling through Facebook, I'm thinking, actually, this is such a good platform to share God's love for people and to share the hope that we can have in him. So, I think everyone can be thinking about how we can share little glimmers of hope for people on our social media, because I think that's one of the places it's starting right now for us.
Brilliant. Thank you so much for joining us. Thank you so much for sharing that. We're super excited to have you back. We're glad, and we know that God's got so much more for you. But thank you for taking the time to join us today.
Well, thanks for that, Matt and Emily, and definitely some food for thought for us there, friends, don't you think? And I just love how actually there's a theme emerging over these last few episodes of having to trust God, even in the things that are changing. I know for all of us have had to make changes, and some of them have been good and some of them have been difficult for us to do. One of the things I know I've definitely changed is my habit of getting out of the house more and making sure I make time for having a daily walk. So I think that's one of the good things that has changed. But as Emily was saying, ultimately it's about trusting God even in the changes. Well, friends, that's all we've got time for on this episode of the Movement Podcast. But as always, we love to hear from you and stay connected. And you can check us out on Instagram, Facebook and Twitter, and make sure you connect with us as well. And of course, you can always check out our website, which is wearemovement.net. But until next time, take care and we'll see you soon.